You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow, and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
In this chilling, true-style horror story, a freelance audio engineer moves into an old Boston apartment, excited to begin a new project restoring vintage tapes. But when strange whispers start seeping through the vents and the recordings begin speaking directly to him, he realizes something is terribly wrong. As the sounds grow more personal and more disturbing, he's pulled into a terrifying mystery that was never meant to be uncovered. If you love immersive horror stories that feel real and stay with you long after they're over, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because at Soul Studios, we tell the stories you were never meant to hear. And remember, sometimes the thing whispering your name already knows you're listening. I moved into apartment 3A of an old Boston brownstone because the rent was absurdly cheap. As a freelance audio engineer restoring old tapes, I jumped at a quiet, affordable space for my gear. The building was creaky and time-worn, chipped brick walls, narrow windows, so I assumed that explained the low price. The landlord seemed oddly relieved when I signed the lease. On my first night, after setting up my reel-to-reel recorder and stacks of dusty tapes, I collapsed onto my futon bed. The street lamp outside cast a flickering amber glow through the thin curtains, and the building was nearly silent, just the distant city hum and an occasional groan of old wood. It was almost too quiet. Just past midnight, as I finally drifted towards sleep, a faint noise made me sit up. It sounded like a whisper, a single breath of voice. My eyes snapped open and I held my breath, listening hard. Nothing now, just the distant wail of a siren and the building settling. After a minute, I exhaled shakily and told myself it was imagination or a quirk of the old pipes. Still, it took a long time for my pounding heart to slow down. The following day passed in a blur of work. I cleaned and converted old recordings for hours, only realizing my own hunger by late afternoon. I heated some leftover pizza and decided to crack a window to air out the musty apartment. While I struggled with the swollen window frame, a sound made me freeze. It was that faint whisper again, drifting through the stillness. I couldn't discern any words, only a hushed, urgent tone. A chill prickled the back of my neck. "Hello?" I called softly into the empty room, feeling a little foolish. No reply, just silence. The only possible source was the ventilation system, a metal grate high on the wall above the kitchen. Dragging a chair over, I climbed up to get closer to the vent. Warm, dusty air tickled my face, carrying a stale whiff of tobacco. I pressed my ear near the slats and listened intently, heart thudding. Nothing now. No voice. The building was quiet, save for the hum of my refrigerator. I shook my head and stepped down, trying to dismiss the unease. It was probably my imagination, or a neighbor's muffled voice carrying through the ducts. Still, that eerie, whispering echo stuck with me as evening fell. Sometime deep in the night, I awoke with a start, certain I'd heard a noise in the apartment. Holding my breath, I listened. A single floorboard had creaked just outside my bedroom. Summoning courage, I crept out and flicked on the living room light. Nothing was there, but then I noticed the air vent above the kitchen was hanging open, one corner dangling as if the screws had been removed. A draft carrying that same stale tobacco smell wafted out. My skin crawled. I knew I hadn't left it like that. Grabbing a screwdriver, I climbed onto the chair and refastened the grate firmly back in place. The old shaft behind it sighed a puff of warm, dusty air as I tightened the screws. "Stay put," I murmured with a nervous chuckle as I patted the metal slats. Hoping it was just a quirk of the aging building, I gulped a glass of water and went back to bed, leaving the hallway light on this time. Sleep eventually came, though fitfully. The next day, I spent as much time out of the apartment as possible to shake off the night's nerves. That evening, as rain pattered against the window, I curled up on the couch with a book, starting to feel at ease. Sleep was about to claim me when a sudden sound jolted me awake. It was my reel-to-reel tape recorder on the desk. It had started playing by itself. I leapt up, disoriented, and hurried to the desk. The tape on the machine was one from my work stack, an old interview from the 1970s. But through the static, that's not what played. A voice was whispering from the speaker, buried in the crackle. I leaned in, heart pounding, straining to catch it. The whisper was distorted, warbling as if underwater, but I caught a few words. "Hear me, Marcus. My name." I jerked back in shock, nearly knocking over the chair. There was no way I imagined that. Somehow the tape was speaking directly to me. With a trembling hand, I stopped the playback. The reels halted, and the apartment fell silent, except for the patter of rain on the glass. I felt the blood draining from my face. How could a decades-old recording know my name? Desperate for a rational explanation, I told myself I must have been nodding off and dreaming. Auditory pareidolia, when the brain finds patterns like voices in random noise, could have made me think I heard my name in the static. Yes, that had to be it. To prove it, I rewound the tape a bit and played it again, holding my breath. The old interview droned in a dull monotone about city politics. No whispering, no mention of me. It was just my stressed mind playing tricks. I exhaled, laughing shakily at how wound up I was. Still, I was rattled. I decided to call it a night. As I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off in that apartment. I resolved that if anything else strange happened, I would capture proof. Being an audio engineer had its perks. I had the tools to investigate. The next morning, I set up a couple of sensitive microphones and a portable recorder, one mic by the vent grate, another in the living room, to run all night. If there were any whispers when I wasn't consciously listening, I'd capture them. I even turned off all the lights to minimize background hum, leaving the apartment shrouded in darkness. I left the recorder running as I went to bed, hopeful it would pick up any unusual sounds during the night. I drifted off surprisingly quickly, exhausted by stress. What woke me several hours later was a loud metallic bang. I shot up, adrenaline flooding my veins. The glowing red digits of my bedside clock read 3:14 a.m. For a moment, I was disoriented in the darkness. Another sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor, echoed from the kitchen. Was someone in here? My heart in my throat, I quietly slid open my bedside drawer and grabbed a heavy flashlight. Not much of a weapon, but solid enough to use as a club. I crept out of bed and tiptoed down the short hallway. As I neared the kitchen, I saw an eerie flicker of green light dancing on the walls. Rounding the corner, I realized it was coming from my recording setup's LED display, which was blinking erratically. The kitchen was a disaster. The chair I'd left by the vent was toppled over. One of the mics lay on the floor, cord twisted. The vent grate I'd screwed in place hung completely off its opening. Both screws were out and placed neatly on the counter, as if someone had carefully removed them. A cold wave of dread washed over me. How could this be? Who could have done this so quietly? I scanned the small apartment with my flashlight beam, palms slick with sweat. No sign of an intruder. Every window was closed and locked. The door still had the chain latched from the inside. Yet someone, or something, had been here. I felt exposed, violated. Trying to control my shaking, I focused on the recorder. The tape had stopped. The memory card was full, having recorded for hours. Whatever happened, it should all be on there. I snatched up the recorder and hit playback, skipping to the latest portion of audio. I held it up to my ear and listened intently. At first I heard only the low hiss of the apartment's ambient noise. Then, faintly, a woman's trembling voice, "Please, don't." Another voice joined, a man's, low and urgent, "Get out." Then more voices layered in, rising into an eerie chorus. It was a cacophony of whispers, dozens of them overlapping and echoing, growing louder. Among them, I caught sobs and pleading cries for help, as if souls trapped in the static were begging me to flee. Through the jumble, they all seemed to be chanting something together. My name. The word echoed over and over, distorted and desperate. Suddenly, a single voice cut through the others, clear and vicious, right next to the microphone. Marcus, you're mine. The playback fell into crackling silence. My blood ran cold. This was no hallucination. Those were real voices, some crying out in fear, one snarling my name. It felt impossibly personal. If those were the spirits of past tenants, they knew who I was, and one of them wanted me. I had to leave. I wanted to bolt right that second and never look back, but a stubborn part of me needed answers. Anger rose in me alongside the fear. I wasn't about to let some thing terrorize me out of my home without understanding what it was. With shaking hands, I slammed the vent grate shut and turned on every light in the apartment, desperate to banish the shadows. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, a mug of untouched tea growing cold between my hands, eyes fixed unblinking on that damn vent. Every so often, I'd hear a faint tick or shift in the walls and my breath would catch, but nothing else happened. The rest of the night passed in suffocating, fearful silence. At first light, I decided I wouldn't be a passive victim. If something lurked in those vents, preying on the people here, I was going to face it and expose it. Fueled by adrenaline and dread, I grabbed my flashlight and the screwdriver, dragged a ladder from the building's maintenance closet, and climbed up to the vent. My hands were shaking, but I managed to pry the grate off and lay it aside. Inside was a vertical metal shaft coated in decades of dust, stretching into darkness. Using the ladder for a boost, I hoisted myself up and into the ventilation duct. The space was tight and the air felt dead. I spotted a narrow gap on one side of the shaft, a hidden crawl space between the walls. Heart hammering, I crawled into that gap, determined to find whatever had been whispering to me. The narrow tunnel was suffocating, but I inched onward. A few yards in, my flashlight beam revealed a tiny hidden chamber within the walls. What I saw made my stomach churn, a little nest of torn cloth and crumpled newspaper, littered with cassette tapes. Dozens of them, some broken, some intact, were scattered amid the debris. My throat clenched as I picked up one tape. In spidery handwriting it read, William, Apt 3A deceased, with a date from 5 years ago. I rifled through others with mounting dread. Marjorie, 3A, deceased. Kevin, 3A, deceased. Name after name, each marked as dead. My hands shook as I realized I was holding a literal catalogue of victims. Then I found a tape that nearly stopped my heart. Unlike the others, it wasn't dusty or aged. Its label had no date, just my name, Marcus, and below it, scrawled in red ink, the word welcome. A surge of terror and anger coursed through me. The entity had prepared a tape for me, anticipating I would soon join its list of victims. Not if I could help it. Gritting my teeth, I shoved several of the tapes into my jacket pockets. Proof of what had happened here, proof that I wasn't crazy. I was determined not to end up just another recording in this creature's collection. I began crawling backward, eager to get out and expose this horror. And then I heard it, a noise from deeper in the tunnel behind me. Shuffling in the darkness. It started as a faint scrape, like claws or nails dragging on wood. My blood turned to ice. Something was back there, and it was coming closer. A soft, eerie chuckle echoed in the darkness, bouncing off the cramped walls. The sound was human-like, but distorted, warbling as if played on an old tape at the wrong speed. It chilled me more than the stale air in that shaft. Suddenly, a rapid scratching noise skittered toward me. Too fast, too unnatural. Panic seized me. I spun around and scrambled on all fours, racing for the vent opening. The tunnel behind erupted with movement as whatever lurked there gave chase. I reached the vertical duct where I had entered, but in my frenzy I misjudged the opening. My shoulder slammed into a metal wall and I slipped. The flashlight flew from my hand, clattering down the shaft and disappearing into the darkness below. I was plunged into blackness. Only a dim sliver of light shone from the open grate leading back into my kitchen, my way out. I lunged toward it. I gripped the edges of the vent from below and heaved myself up, my head and shoulders emerging into my kitchen. Just as relief dawned, something latched onto my right ankle with crushing force. A cold hand, or what felt like a hand, yanked me backward, dragging my lower body into the shaft. I screamed in desperation, fingers white-knuckled on the vent frame. The stench of decay and tobacco rolled out of the vent as the thing behind me pulled harder. I kicked wildly with my free leg, connecting with what felt like a wiry limb. The grip on my ankle loosened for a split second. In that moment, a voice right behind my ear spoke in a horrifying multi-tonal whisper, as if a dozen mouths uttered in unison.
Stay with us.
It wasn't loud, but it resonated inside my skull, freezing my blood. With a burst of adrenaline, I wrenched myself forward, tearing out of the vent opening. I sprawled onto the kitchen floor, scrambling away on my elbows as the grate suddenly slammed shut behind me with a metallic clang. The apartment fell into an eerie quiet. I lay there on my back, gasping for breath, staring at the now closed vent. Had I actually escaped? I wasn't going to wait around to find out. Ignoring the pain in my leg, I stumbled to my feet and bolted for the apartment door. If I could just reach the hallway, maybe I'd be safe. I fumbled with the deadbolt, hands slick with sweat. The moment the door cracked open an inch, an icy blast of air surged from behind me, and every light in the apartment flickered out. The hallway light beyond my door exploded in a burst of glass, plunging everything into darkness. Before I could react, a powerful force slammed into my back. I was hurled against the door, which crashed shut under my weight. Dazed, I yanked on the handle, but invisible hands seized my shoulders and dragged me backward with inhuman strength. I screamed, legs kicking out, my fingernails scraping futilely along the wooden floorboards as I was pulled away from the doorway. The whispers rose all around me in the dark, a susurration of triumph. Over my own cries, I heard that familiar cold breath against my ear. It was the last thing I ever heard. 2 months later, apartment 3A had a new tenant. The landlord never mentioned the bizarre disappearance of Marcus Schulman. Officially, he had simply broken his lease and vanished, leaving most of his belongings behind. After a cursory clean-up and a fresh coat of paint, the place was back on the market. A young woman in her 20s, excited to move into a charming brownstone for cheap, signed the lease. In her first week unpacking, she noticed something peculiar. The metal vent grate in the kitchen looked newer than the rest of the apartment, secured with shiny, unworn screws. It struck her as odd, but she shrugged it off, assuming maintenance had replaced it recently due to some issue. On her first night sleeping in 3A, she was startled awake by a noise. It sounded like someone moving furniture far above, or a voice echoing faintly through the walls. She couldn't be sure. It was so muffled she thought she might have dreamed it. The next day, she laughed it away as the typical creaks and quirks of an old building settling. A couple days later, while organizing the cabinet under the kitchen sink, she found a small cardboard box shoved way in the back. Inside was a single cassette tape with no case. Curious, she held it up to the light. A word was scribbled on the label in red ink. Welcome. Puzzled, she pulled out her dusty old cassette player. She kept it for playing thrift store mixtapes, and popped the tape in. As the tape began to play, a soft hiss filled her kitchen. For a moment, it was just static. Then a man's gentle voice emerged, sounding distant and a little warbled. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. The young woman frowned. The tone was oddly warm, almost too friendly. The voice continued in a whisper she could barely catch, and she could have sworn it said her name. Her stomach flipped. How could that be? Uneasy, she stopped the tape and ejected it. Perhaps it was some kind of prank left by the previous tenant, a weird welcome message spliced together with her name from gossip or paperwork. Whatever it wasn't funny. She decided to forget it and tucked the tape back in the box. That night, as she lay in bed, she found herself straining to hear any little noise. Sometime after midnight, just as she was finally drifting off, a soft whispering sound wafted through the darkness of her bedroom. It was so faint, she wasn't sure it was real until she heard it again. Unmistakably words this time, spoken from somewhere beyond the walls. It almost sounded like a person gently greeting her from inside the vent. Hello. And in the lonely silence of apartment 3A, the whispering continued, ever so quietly. The new tenant would soon learn that she was not alone in the dark. If you think whispers in the dark are just your imagination, think again. Because in apartment 3A, the voices aren't echoes, they're invitations. And once you listen, you're already part of the collection. Some tapes are never meant to be played, and some voices were never meant to stop.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained, and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.